Elite principal panics when the school server crashes. Then a 12-year-old black student walks in and shocked everyone. His name is Maxwell. His calm demeanor hadn't changed. It was as if this was just another day at the office for him. Davis stared at the boy in awe, his mind racing to catch up with what had just occurred. A 12-year-old, a crisis no one else could solve. And yet Maxwell had done it. He had saved the entire event. As the noise in the room died down, Maxwell's voice cut through the tension. "You want to know how I did it?" His tone was unassuming, almost casual, but his answer was going to change everything. Hello, Story family. Welcome back to the channel. I'm so glad you're here today. Make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share this video with your friends. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. I love hearing from all of you. Let's dive into today's story. You won't want to miss it. Eastwood Academy sat on a hill, its gleaming stone walls rising like a monument to the future. The campus was a sleek mixture of old-world prestige and cutting-edge technology, its sprawling lawns dotted with carefully sculpted trees. The faint hum of activity echoed from the brightly lit windows, where students moved purposefully, their expressions driven and focused. The building itself seemed to breathe, alive with potential and the weight of ambition. Inside, every hallway, every classroom, and every corner of the school seemed designed to prepare young minds for greatness. Interactive whiteboards flashed in every classroom, presenting complex algorithms and abstract concepts in vivid, high-definition colors. Everywhere you looked, there was a constant buzz of activity. Students collaborating in virtual spaces, accessing real-time data on sleek screens that hung on the walls, each lesson unfolding with a precision and efficiency that bordered on the futuristic. In Eastwood's world, excellence was not just encouraged, it was expected. But the real magic happened in the rooms reserved for the most extraordinary projects. In these spaces, students weren't just learning, they were inventing. Whether it was a complex AI system designed to predict and prevent climate change, or a sculpture that responded to the viewer's emotions, the boundaries of science and art seemed to blur. It was in these spaces that dreams were being shaped, ideas molded, and futures made. And that was why this year's event, the Scientific and Art Presentation, was the most anticipated in Eastwood Academy's history. Principal Davis stood in his office, peering out the large windows that framed the view of the school grounds. His office, an oasis of order in a world full of chaos, was the heart of the Academy's leadership. At 45, Davis had become something of a legend in educational circles. He was known for his vision and his uncompromising pursuit of perfection. Under his guidance, Eastwood had transformed from a respected private school to a premier institution, one that attracted the world's brightest minds. Yet today, as he watched students walk across the campus with heads held high, there was a tightness in his chest that no amount of accolades could relieve. The pressure of the event loomed large. The stakes were higher than ever before. The Scientific and Art Presentation was more than just a showcase. It was an audition, a chance for Eastwood's best and brightest to prove their worth in front of some of the most influential people in the world. Tech moguls, renowned artists, and scientists who could open doors to unimaginable opportunities. These were the kind of people who could shape careers and change lives. Every student presenting that day had worked tirelessly on their projects, some for months, others for years. Their creations weren't just innovations, they were declarations. The students wanted the world to know they were ready, that they had something to offer, something that would make an impact. As Davis glanced at the clock, he reminded himself of the sheer magnitude of the event. The presentation was the pinnacle of years of work. The entire school was counting on it. And in Davis's mind, it wasn't just about the students, it was about his own legacy. This was his chance to solidify Eastwood's position as a leader in education, to show that his vision had paid off. Yet there was one thing that haunted him: the school's newly installed server system. The system was the backbone of the entire event. designed to manage everything from real-time presentations to the complex networks of data that would allow students to collaborate seamlessly. It was supposed to be the next step in Eastwood's evolution, cutting-edge technology, designed to push the boundaries of what a school could offer. But the system had never been tested at this scale. The pressure of managing hundreds of live projects, real-time feedback from guests, interactive elements, and the constant flow of data between devices, it was all riding on this one fragile, untested infrastructure. And Principal Davis couldn't shake the feeling that something might go wrong. If the system failed, it would be catastrophic. The event's success hinged on it. In the months leading up to the presentation, the school had held practice runs. The system had been stress-tested in isolated environments, but nothing could replicate the complexity of the event itself. There was a slight hesitation in Davis's mind whenever he walked past the sleek server racks that hummed quietly in the new tech hub, machines that promised to deliver perfection, but only if they could hold up under the weight of the entire school's hopes. Davis's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden ringing of his phone. He glanced at the screen. It was Mark, the head of it. "Principal Davis," Mark said, his voice sharp, tinged with urgency. "We're running a final check on the server systems before the event starts. Everything's looking good on our end." Davis's stomach twisted. "What do you mean, looking good?" "It needs to work flawlessly, Mark. We can't afford any issues. Everything depends on this event. If the system goes down—" "I understand, sir," Mark interrupted. "We've got backup plans in place. We're monitoring everything closely. I'm confident the system will hold up." Davis's mind raced. There was no room for error. If the server system faltered, the event would be a disaster. The students' hard work, the sponsors' expectations, the entire reputation of the academy, it all rested on the fragile network of servers that connected them all. The final preparations were underway, and the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Students moved through the hallways in clusters, their expressions a mix of excitement and nervousness. Some had perfected their projects to the smallest detail, while others were tweaking final elements in a frenzy. The tension was thick, palpable, each student silently weighing the consequences of their work. No one dared speak too loudly. No one could risk breaking their focus. Davis stood near the entrance to the main auditorium, watching as students prepared for their moment in the spotlight. The staff moved like clockwork, adjusting lights, sound, and camera angles. It was as if the entire world had aligned to focus on this one event. The live broadcast cameras had been set up, the room buzzing with energy, the air alive with the hum of technology. Yet through all of it, Principal Davis couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him. As much as he trusted the students, as much as he knew they were ready, he couldn't ignore the sense that something might go wrong. His gaze shifted to the servers again, hidden behind the sleek glass walls of the tech hub, distant yet all-encompassing. The weight of everything, his career, the future of the academy, the dreams of every student, rested on that one fragile system. He took a deep breath, his hands cold and clammy, but steeled himself. He had come too far. Eastwood Academy had worked too hard to get to this moment. The final test was here. The stage was set, and now everything depended on it. The auditorium was bathed in the soft glow of stage lights, and a quiet excitement filled the space as families, faculty, and students settled into their seats. Cameras were poised to capture the event, microphones waiting to pick up the smallest sound. It was a moment that had been months, even years, in the making. Each student had poured hours of effort into their projects, and now it was their time to shine. The audience, comprising wealthy parents, tech moguls, and renowned artists, waited, eager to witness the next great breakthrough. The first student stood at the center of the stage, their voice steady as they introduced their project. An eye-driven sculpture that changed shape based on the viewer's emotional response. The project worked seamlessly, transitioning through various forms as the audience watched in awe. The applause was genuine, filled with admiration, As the first round of presentations unfolded, the energy in the room only grew. The students had done it. The world was about to see what Eastwood Academy's finest minds could create. Principal Davis stood at the back of the auditorium, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room with a practiced intensity. He had seen these students grow and excel over the years, and today they were proving that their hard work was worth every ounce of effort. His chest swelled with pride. But beneath that, there was something else, an undercurrent of anxiety, a small voice in his head whispering doubts. He tried to shake it off. Everything was going perfectly, right? The servers were running smoothly, and the technology was working as promised. For all his preparation, the careful planning of months, it all felt like it was finally falling into place. But then came the first sign of trouble. It was subtle at first, an imperceptible flicker on the main screen. The live feed started to lag, the crisp, high-definition images stuttering for just a moment. A pause. Then another flicker. Principal Davis's eyes narrowed as he glanced toward the back of the room, where the IT team was stationed, watching monitors with keen attention. They didn't seem to react immediately, and for a second, Davis thought it was just a glitch, a temporary glitch easily fixed. But then the lag grew. It wasn't just a flicker anymore. The images began to slow down, each movement stuttering as if the entire system were hesitating, unsure of what it was supposed to do. Davis's stomach tightened as he watched the first student's presentation, an augmented reality model that solved problems related to urban planning. Freeze mid-transition. The model, once sleek and fluid, hung there, frozen in time, as if the very concept of movement had been stolen away from it. A hushed murmur rippled through the audience. The students on stage tried to salvage their work, tapping frantically on their screens, but nothing responded. The screen behind them remained a frozen image, an unsolvable puzzle. "Is there a problem?" A voice called from the front. It was one of the parents, clearly concerned. The A-team leaped into action. Mark, the head of it, was already at his station, his fingers moving across the keyboard with urgency. He muttered to himself, furiously checking different systems and protocols. Beside him, his team scrambled for any solution, trying desperately to track down the source of the issue. One of the technicians reached for the phone, dialing the server company's support line, but after several seconds, he cursed under his breath. "The line's busy," the technician said, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure. "What do you mean busy?" Mark snapped, his face pale. "Get through. We need them now." But the phone line was dead. No response. As each second passed, the room seemed to grow heavier. Davis could feel the blood drain from his face as he watched the frantic attempts to restore the system. The once pristine event had begun to crumble before his eyes. The first student on stage, the one with the frozen urban planning model, tried to salvage what they could, but the tension was palpable. Their fingers trembled as they tapped at their device. But nothing happened. The audience, initially so captivated, shifted in their seats. Whispers spread. Concern became visible on every face. Davis, unable to look away from the unfolding disaster, felt his chest tighten with every passing second. His worst fear, the one he had carried with him for months, was happening in real time. The IT team was now in full-blown panic mode. They worked furiously, rebooting systems, trying to run diagnostics, but the servers were unresponsive. Mark, his forehead glistening with sweat, turned to the team with a look of disbelief. "What's going on?" he demanded. "Why isn't it working?" It was fine in testing. "It's not just lag anymore," one technician said, his voice faltering. "The entire system's frozen. There's no way to access the files." As the panic intensified, Davis could feel his grip on controls slipping. His hands clenched at his sides, his knuckles white. He had to do something, say something, but the words felt lodged in his throat. His thoughts were scattered, a million things running through his mind at once. The prestigious guests, the parents, the reporters. Everything depended on this event, and it was falling apart. "Is there any way to fix this?" Davis asked, his voice strained, his eyes never leaving the screen that now displayed nothing but static. Mark shook his head, the look on his face one of defeat. "We're working on it, but if the servers aren't responding, there's nothing we can do right now." "I'm sorry, Principal." As Davis turned back toward the crowd, the murmurs had turned into low conversations. Parents who had once beamed with pride at their children's accomplishments now exchanged uneasy glances. Some were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others were already gathering their things, preparing to leave. The guests who had come to scout talent were looking at each other with quiet resignation. The students, their hearts still in their throats, watched helplessly as their hard work, their dreams, faded into the growing silence. A few of the students on stage tried to laugh it off, attempting to make light of the situation. But the tension was undeniable. One of them cracked a nervous joke about the system taking a break, but it fell flat, swallowed by the heavy atmosphere. No one laughed. Davis's fingers dug into his palms as he tried to force himself to stay calm. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to fix it, to take control and make it right, but there was nothing to be done. The servers, the technological backbone of everything Eastwood stood for, had betrayed him. Minutes passed like hours. The next presenter stood nervously at the edge of the stage, their project, a prototype for an AI medical diagnostic tool, loading on the screen, but the screen stayed black. No images, no graphics, nothing. Davis stood frozen in the back of the room, watching as the room, once filled with excitement, shifted into a sea of discomfort and confusion. Students and parents exchanged worried glances, their faces painted with frustration, confusion, and concern. Some parents were already heading toward the exits, while others shot worried looks toward the staff, demanding answers. But there were no answers. Not yet. Principal Davis could feel his throat tightening, his breath shallow, the weight of the moment threatening to crush him. The event, which should have been the pinnacle of everything he had worked for, was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every second felt like a small eternity as the time for the next presentation drew closer, and nothing worked. Then, in the midst of the despair, a voice sliced through the murmur of voices, steady and calm. "Principal Davis." Davis's head snapped up, instinctively looking for the source. There, standing in the doorway, was Maxwell. Maxwell wasn't a part of the group that anyone would have expected to solve this crisis. He wasn't polished, well-dressed, or someone whose name was often mentioned in the same breath as Eastwood's brightest stars. He was a quiet, unassuming figure, someone who spent more time in the shadows, his head buried in code or tinkering with gadgets rather than presenting his work in front of a crowd. At just 12 years old, Maxwell had already proven himself to be a tech prodigy, but his brilliance was often overshadowed by the more extroverted students who had learned to use their charm and presentation skills to shine. Maxwell was dressed in a simple, faded t-shirt and a pair of jeans, the kind that had seen better days. His hair, wild and unkempt, framed his face like a halo of creative chaos, his eyes sharp and focused in a way that betrayed a level of intelligence far beyond his years. He wasn't part of the well-dressed, high-status crowd in the auditorium. He wasn't the student who had spent months rehearsing speeches or perfecting the art of presentation. And yet, in this moment, as chaos unfolded around him, he looked like the only one who truly understood what was happening. Davis blinked, momentarily unsure if he had heard correctly. "Maxwell," he asked, his voice hoarse from the tension. "What are you doing here?" Maxwell didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his presence so calm it almost felt out of place amid the chaos. "I think I can fix it," he said simply, as if he was discussing something as ordinary as the weather. Davis froze, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of disbelief and desperation. You want to fix the system." He couldn't hide the skepticism in his voice. Maxwell wasn't part of the high-performance team, the tech experts who had been handpicked to handle this event. He wasn't a part of the glitzy, high-profile presentations that were being broadcast to the world. He was the quiet kid who never quite fit into the world of polished appearances. Why would Davis trust him now? The system was down. It was a catastrophe. Maxwell, however, didn't flinch at the doubt in Davis's gaze. His expression remained unshaken, his confidence steady, as if he had already mapped out the solution in his mind. "I know how to do it," he said, his voice low but resolute. "I've been working with the system's architecture. I just need a chance." Davis stared at him, feeling the overwhelming weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had no other options. The IT team had tried everything they could. The servers were unresponsive, the backups useless. No one else seemed to know how to fix it, and the event was slipping further from his control with every second that passed. The room was filled with frustrated whispers, the weight of judgment pressing in from all sides. It was then that Davis felt the cold realization hit him. He had to take a chance. Maxwell, despite his appearance, might be the only one who could do it. The silence in the room grew louder as Davis hesitated. The young student standing before him seemed so out of place in this world of high expectations, yet his calm demeanor held an unexpected power. Davis's mind raced, torn between his disbelief and the sinking desperation that had gripped him since the server failure began. What other choice did he have? He nodded reluctantly, the words spilling out as if forced by the circumstances. "All right," Davis said, his voice edged with urgency. "Try, but be quick." Maxwell's eyes flickered with a brief moment of acknowledgement, a silent understanding that this was his chance, the moment he had been waiting for, even if no one else realized it. Without another word, he slipped past Davis and moved toward the back of the auditorium, where the IT team was still trying, and failing, to regain control over the system. The murmur of conversation faltered as Maxwell made his way through the room, his movements purposeful but not rushed. To an outsider, he might have looked calm to the point of indifference, but Davis could see something more, a quiet intensity in the way he moved, as if every step he took was deliberate, every second filled with purpose. Maxwell reached the back of the room and sat down at an unoccupied workstation. He didn't ask for permission or introductions. His fingers immediately hovered over the keyboard, his eyes scanning the rows of data and commands flashing across the screen. He was lost in his world of logic and code, the noise of the room fading into the background as his mind focused on the task at hand. His fingers danced over the keys, each movement fluid and precise, a silent symphony of thought and action. Davis watched from the doorway, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely breathe, his entire focus fixated on the young boy working tirelessly at the computer. Every passing second felt like an eternity, the minutes dragging on as the next presentation loomed, and the failure of the system hung like a dark cloud over the event. Maxwell didn't look up. He didn't even acknowledge the growing tension in the room. He was too focused, too absorbed in the problem. Davis could see the small movements of Maxwell's fingers, the way his eyes darted between lines of code, searching for the flaw in the system, the reason why it had failed. "What is he doing?" one of the IT staff muttered under his breath, clearly more confused than impressed by Maxwell's rapid pace. "He's troubleshooting the root issue," another replied, although even they didn't seem entirely sure. No one in the room had the clarity Maxwell had, the insight into the system that only he seemed to possess. Davis took a slow step back, his heart still pounding in his chest. Could this really work? Could a 12-year-old fix this when no one else could? Maxwell wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to be the one to save the day. But as Davis watched the boy work, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in hours. The quiet hum of the room seemed to fade entirely as the seconds ticked by. Davis shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the tension in his shoulders building as he kept his eyes locked on Maxwell. The next presentation was moments away, and nothing was ready. Nothing was working. Maxwell paused for just a moment, his fingers hovering above the keyboard as he glanced toward the screen. For the first time, He looked up from the monitor, his face calm but focused, his eyes locking with Davis. "I think I've found it," he said, his voice steady, almost calm. "I just need one more minute." Principal Davis felt a small surge of hope. Was this possible? Could Maxwell truly fix this where the professionals had failed? The clock ticked louder in his mind as he waited for that one final moment, his pulse quickening, his thoughts racing. He could hear the buzz of the audience growing louder. It was now or never. Maxwell walked calmly through the maze of tech equipment, past the rows of monitors flashing urgent alerts and frantic red error messages. The room was filled with a sense of panic, the air thick with the sense that everything was spiraling out of control. The IT staff stood clustered together, their faces a mixture of frustration and confusion, but they parted for Maxwell as he approached the terminal. Davis followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the room, his heart pounding. This was it. He had placed his last hope in this quiet, unassuming student, a 12-year-old who had barely spoken a word during the event, but had now become the last thread of salvation. Maxwell didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. His movements were slow and deliberate, completely at odds with the frantic atmosphere surrounding him. The terminal screen blinked back at him, a blinking cursor waiting for his command. Maxwell sat down, pushing the IT team aside with quiet confidence, his fingers already poised above the keyboard. Maxwell typed quickly, his fingers moving over the keys in a blur of motion. He scanned the logs on the screen, his eyes flicking back and forth as if he were reading a familiar text, every line of code familiar to him. His brow furrowed slightly, but there was no panic, no hesitation in his movements. His eyes flickered for just a moment, his fingers pausing over the keys. He muttered something under his breath, his voice barely audible above the hum of the machines. "It's malware," Maxwell said, his voice so steady it was almost eerie. The IT team stopped in their tracks, their heads snapping toward him in disbelief. One of the technicians, his face pale, stepped forward. "What do you mean, malware?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "This is a state-of-the-art server. How could it be infected?" Maxwell didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked onto the logs, reading each one as though it were an open book. "It's not just any malware," he said finally, his tone unhurried. "It's ransomware." Davis, still standing behind him, felt a chill run down his spine. Ransomware. The words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. "Ransomware," he repeated, barely able to comprehend what Maxwell was saying. "How could that have happened? We have security protocols in place, multiple firewalls, and the latest updates. How could something like this slip through?" Maxwell didn't even look up from the screen. "It was planted," he said, "inside a routine update. Whoever did this was careful. They knew exactly what they were doing." His fingers paused for just a moment as he clicked through more logs. The malware was triggered when the server tried to handle the increased data load for the event. Right when it was about to scale up, that's when the ransomware activated. It locked the entire system. Davis's mind raced, the implications hitting him hard. Someone had deliberately sabotaged the system, hidden within the very update that was supposed to ensure everything ran smoothly. The thought of it made his stomach turn. The scale of the betrayal was staggering. Someone somewhere had known that this event was critical, that the stakes were high, and they had used that knowledge to execute a calculated attack. Davis clenched his fists, a wave of anger and helplessness flooding through him. "So, you're saying we've been hacked? Our entire system is locked down because of some malware?" His voice cracked with frustration. Maxwell, who had barely moved, nodded. "Exactly. Whoever did this wanted to shut down the event, cause chaos. And it worked." For a long moment, the room was silent. Davis's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just a tech failure. It was an attack. An attack on Eastwood Academy, on everything he had worked for, on the students who had poured their hearts into these projects. The very foundation of the school, its reputation, its future, had been put in jeopardy by someone who knew exactly how to exploit its weaknesses. But as the weight of this revelation settled over him, Maxwell didn't pause. He simply shifted in his seat, his focus never leaving the screen. His fingers began typing again, faster this time, as though the discovery of the malware had only sharpened his resolve. The IT team watched, their expressions a mixture of awe and helplessness, as Maxwell worked. He didn't ask for anyone's help. He didn't need anyone's approval. He was in his element now. Davis stepped back slightly, giving Maxwell the space he needed. He had no idea what Maxwell was doing or how he was doing it, but he couldn't ignore the quiet confidence in the boy's movements. It was clear now that Maxwell wasn't just a student with a knack for technology. He was something more. He was the one who had the skills to fix this, to turn the tide. Maxwell reached into his backpack and pulled out his old laptop, the worn edges of the device contrasting sharply with the sleek, expensive machines around him. Without a word, he opened it up and began typing even faster. He was writing something, his fingers flying over the keys with practiced ease. Davis watched him, feeling the strange sense of disbelief. How could this young boy, who had never made a splash at Eastwood, who was so often overlooked, be the one to save the day? But there was no time to dwell on the mystery of it. Maxwell was working, and Davis was praying that it would be enough. The IT team huddled behind Maxwell, watching his every move, their previous skepticism giving way to awe. "He's writing custom scripts," one of the technicians whispered. "I've never seen anything like this. This kid's a genius." Maxwell's fingers moved relentlessly, a rhythm of brilliance that made everything else in the room fade away. With every line of code he typed, the system began to respond. Slowly, at first. A flicker on one of the monitors, a slight tremor in the server's interface. Then another. The logs began to shift, the errors subsiding, replaced by a steady stream of data. The system was waking up. Maxwell didn't pause. He kept typing, his mind already several steps ahead. His eyes flickered between the terminal and his laptop screen, carefully guiding the process as though he were conducting a symphony. One line of code at a time, the server began to regain its functionality. The files that had been locked away by the ransomware were being decrypted, their data restored, the system coming back online piece by piece. "Come on," Maxwell muttered under his breath, as if urging the system to follow his lead. Then, with a final press of a key, he hit enter, and the room fell into an expectant silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. Davis held his breath, watching Maxwell's eyes, waiting for any sign of progress. Then, without warning, the first flicker of success appeared on the screen. The data was restored. The project files reappeared. The servers hummed back to life. One by one, the monitors began to light up. The system's interface blinked back into view, showing the students' presentations, their data once again accessible. The IT staff exchanged astonished glances, the room filled with the low sound of quiet exhalations, the tension slowly lifting. Maxwell sat back in his chair, his hand still resting lightly on the keyboard as if the task had been effortless. He glanced up at Principal Davis, his expression calm, even a little smug. "It's done," he said simply. Davis's chest swelled with a mixture of relief and disbelief. The impossible had been done. The event wasn't ruined. The students' hard work hadn't been lost. The presentation system was back online. As the hum of the servers settled into a steady rhythm and the monitors flickered back to life, a quiet sense of relief spread through the room. The IT team exchanged looks of disbelief, the weight of the last hour lifting from their shoulders as they watched the system fully restore itself. The screens now displayed the students' data, their projects uncorrupted and ready for presentation once more. The chaos had been contained. The event, which had seemed moments away from collapse, was now back on track. But Maxwell didn't celebrate. He didn't smile, didn't even look up at the applause that came from some of the staff, or the relieved murmurs of the IT team. He simply closed his laptop, stood up from the terminal, and walked over to Principal Davis, who was still processing what had just happened. Maxwell's calm demeanor hadn't changed. It was as if this was just another day at the office for him. Davis stared at the boy in awe, his mind racing to catch up with what had just occurred. Maxwell, a 12-year-old, had saved the event. He had fixed a crisis that no one else could even begin to understand. As the noise of the room settled into a quiet hum, Maxwell's voice broke the silence. "You want to know how I did it?" he asked, his tone unassuming, almost casual. Davis, still in a daze from the whirlwind of events, nodded, eager to understand. The IT team leaned in, hanging on every word. "I grew up in a different world than most of the people here," Maxwell began, his eyes drifting towards the window for a moment, as if he were recalling memories long buried. "I wasn't raised with much. My mom worked 2 jobs, and I had to help out. She did what she could, but the bills always seemed to pile up." He paused, his gaze shifting back to the group, his voice a little quieter now. "I worked at a factory. My job was to clean the floors. Nothing glamorous." Davis listened intently, a surge of empathy rising in him. Maxwell wasn't the typical student at Eastwood. He wasn't one of the polished, well-dressed faces who walked the halls of the academy with an air of confidence. He was different, but Davis could see now that Maxwell's difference wasn't a weakness. It was the very thing that made him extraordinary. "One day," Maxwell continued, "I was cleaning in one of the back rooms when I saw this developer working on some hardware. There was a chip he was tinkering with, and I didn't understand it at all. But I knew it was important. I asked him a simple question. 'What's that?' It was just curiosity. That's all." Davis leaned in a little closer, his eyes narrowing as he listened. He could already sense where this story was going, but he couldn't imagine what could have come of such an innocuous moment. "What happened next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell didn't smile, but there was a slight glimmer in his eyes, something that showed how much that moment had meant to him. "He could have brushed me off. Most people do. But instead, he looked at me, smiled, and said, 'That's a good question.' He showed me what he was working on, talked to me about the software he was writing, the problems he was solving. And he didn't just show me the surface stuff. He took me under his wing, spent the next year teaching me everything he knew." There was a pause, the weight of Maxwell's words settling in the room like an anchor. The IT team looked at each other, their eyes wide, processing what they had just heard. They had been trying to solve this problem using their own methods, following strict protocols and troubleshooting routines, but Maxwell had done it in a way none of them could have imagined. He had learned not from textbooks or classrooms, but from real-world experience, from someone who had taken the time to teach him what mattered. Maxwell shifted his weight, standing taller now, the story unfolding naturally as he continued. "I never really had time for school, not in the way other kids did. My mom needed me to work. But after that year with the developer, I started teaching myself coding. I used what I could, taught myself in my spare time, fixing small things around the factory. I started solving problems they didn't even know they had. Eventually, they asked me to join the staff. By then, I was learning more and more about software development and problem solving. Not the kind of stuff you get in school, but real, hands-on stuff." Davis watched the boy, his mind working to piece together the story. The pieces fit in a way that was hard to ignore. Maxwell wasn't just a brilliant mind. He was a survivor, a product of grit, curiosity, and raw determination. He hadn't followed the prescribed path of academia. Instead, he had carved his own way. And that was why he was able to see the solution when others couldn't. "I started working at the factory full-time," Maxwell continued, "and I used my earnings to pay for my school fees. My mom, she always worried, but I did what I could to help. And I saved what I could too. For the future." The room was silent for a long moment, everyone processing the weight of Maxwell's words. Davis felt a mix of admiration and disbelief. How many times had he dismissed the quiet, unassuming students, the ones who didn't fit into the usual mold? How many times had he placed his faith in the wrong things? Maxwell, the boy who had always flown under the radar, was the one who had saved the day. Maxwell shifted his gaze, his voice lowering slightly. I don't do it for the recognition. I do it because I like fixing things. I like solving problems that seem impossible, that no one else can solve. And this. He gestured to the now functional system, the restored files, the relief faces around the room. This was just another problem that needed fixing. Davis felt a lump rise in his throat. He had known Maxwell as just another student in the academy, a quiet kid who didn't stand out in the crowd. He had never guessed that beneath the unassuming exterior, Maxwell had a mind like no other, one that could break down barriers, solve complex problems, and think in ways that others couldn't even begin to comprehend. Maxwell wasn't just some kid who had gotten lucky. He had earned his place here, not through wealth or status, but through sheer determination and a hunger to learn that far surpassed anything Davis had seen before. The thought of how many other Maxwells there might be, students who were overlooked because they didn't fit into the polished image Eastwood so often prized, struck Davis deeply. That's amazing, one of the IT technicians said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was full of admiration. You're a real genius, Maxwell. Maxwell shrugged, his usual modesty returning. I just like solving problems, he repeated. Davis took a deep breath, the weight of the past few hours slowly lifting. He had seen the best of Eastwood's students, the ones with Ivy League offers and multi-million-dollar futures. But in that moment, it was Maxwell, the self-taught genius from an entirely different world, who had proven that brilliance didn't always look the way you expected. Maxwell, the quiet kid who had once been dismissed by so many, had the skills to save the day. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted almost immediately after Maxwell's intervention. The chaos that had once threatened to ruin the event was replaced with a quiet, simmering buzz of excitement as the system returned to life. The students' projects were once again visible on the big screens, their hard work no longer lost to the void of an unresponsive server. The audience, who had moments ago been on the brink of disappointment, now leaned forward in their seats, eager to see what these brilliant young minds had to offer. Maxwell's work had been a quiet miracle. No grand speeches or dramatic moments. He had simply sat at the terminal, his fingers moving with purpose, solving the problem with the kind of grace that only came from someone who truly understood the technology. And now, as the presentations resumed, it was as though the entire room had been reborn. The students, once unsure of whether their work would ever see the light of day, now presented with newfound confidence, their projects running smoothly, showcasing their creativity, intelligence, and ambition. Davis stood at the back of the room, his eyes fixed on the stage, watching as each student stepped forward to present their work. The same students who had been anxious and uncertain only moments ago were now filled with pride as they spoke about their projects. AI-driven sculptures, sustainable technology for clean water, virtual models for disaster recovery. The brilliance that had been hidden behind the disaster of a failed system now shone brighter than ever. The first student's presentation, which had been cut short by the server crash, now proceeded without a hitch. The augmented reality model that had once stuttered on the screen was now flawless, its transitions smooth and impressive. The audience leaned in, captivated by the technology, applauding when the model shifted in response to the viewer's emotions. There was a sense of relief in the air, a collective exhale as the event, which had seemed destined for failure, was suddenly back on track. Maxwell remained in the background, unnoticed by most of the guests as they focused on the students and their projects. His work was done. The problem had been solved, and the event had resumed its course. But there was something in the air now, something electric. It wasn't just the technology working flawlessly. It was the realization that the event had turned around, that what could have been a catastrophe was now becoming a triumph. Principal Davis couldn't quite believe it. The past hour had been a whirlwind. One moment, his worst nightmare, and the next, a miraculous recovery that no one could have predicted. As he watched the students on stage, their presentations unfolding with the smooth precision of a well-oiled machine, he couldn't help but think back to his fears earlier in the day. His greatest gamble had been the server system. It had let him down, but in the end, it was Maxwell who had saved the day. Davis could hardly believe it. What had seemed like an impending disaster was now a success, and it was all because of a quiet, overlooked student who had worked tirelessly in the shadows. And then, as the final presentation came to a close, Principal Davis stood from his seat. The audience, still buzzing with excitement from the last few hours, turned their attention to him. He cleared his throat, his voice strong but filled with a deep sense of gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone carrying across the room, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge something very special about today's event. As you've seen, our students have presented groundbreaking work, showing us that the future is truly in capable hands. But there's one individual who deserves our recognition, someone who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that today's event went off without a hitch." Davis paused, scanning the room, his eyes landing on Maxwell, who stood off to the side. His eyes trained on the floor, his hands tucked into his pockets, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. Davis smiled, the admiration in his gaze unmistakable. "Maxwell, would you please come up here?" The crowd fell silent, a ripple of surprise running through the guests as Maxwell hesitated for a moment. The boy had never been one to seek the spotlight. In fact, he'd spent most of the day avoiding it, staying out of the way of the more polished, well-spoken students. But now, as Davis called him to the front, there was no escaping the spotlight. Maxwell's movements were slow, almost reluctant, as he walked up to the front of the room. His jeans, worn from years of use, seemed out of place next to the sharp suits and tailored dresses of the other students and guests. But none of that mattered. As Maxwell reached the front, the entire auditorium stood up. The applause was thunderous, the sound echoing off the walls, shaking the very foundation of the room. The students, many of whom had been nervous and unsure just an hour before, now clapped and cheered, their faces filled with admiration for the boy who had turned the entire event around. Maxwell's eyes widened, his cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He hadn't expected this. Recognition wasn't something he craved, nor was it something he had ever gotten used to. He had always been the quiet kid, the one who stayed in the background, working hard without anyone noticing. But now, as the applause continued, he stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of a moment he had never imagined would come. Davis stepped forward, placing a hand on Maxwell's shoulder. "This young man," he said, his voice strong and clear, "not only saved this event, but he reminded us all of what true brilliance looks like. It's not about flashy presentations or high-profile pedigrees. It's about problem-solving, dedication, and the willingness to do what others can't." Maxwell's quick thinking and technical expertise ensured that the event went forward, and for that, we owe him a great deal. The applause grew louder, the sound a steady wave that seemed to envelop Maxwell in its warmth. For a moment, he stood still, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't used to being the center of anything. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, parents, students, guests, and faculty members who had all witnessed his quiet intervention, something in him shifted. He realized that it wasn't about being noticed. It was about knowing that he had done something meaningful, something that had made a real difference. The applause continued for several more moments, and slowly, Maxwell's discomfort began to fade. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, the faces of people who had once overlooked him, people who had dismissed him as just another student without the right pedigree or presentation. And now, in this moment, he was their hero. It wasn't just the guests who clapped. The students, many of whom had been too focused on their own projects to notice Maxwell, were now standing, applauding him with a newfound respect. The quiet boy who had been overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued was now the hero of the event. Maxwell gave a small, shy wave to the crowd, his face flushed with the recognition that was being thrust upon him. He wasn't comfortable with the spotlight, but in this moment, he knew that he had earned it. As the applause finally died down, Davis turned to the crowd with a smile. "Let's hear it one more time for Maxwell, the true unsung hero of today's event." The crowd erupted once more, the standing ovation lasting longer than any of them had expected. Maxwell stood, his heart racing, but there was no denying the truth now. In this room full of brilliant minds, it was the quiet, overlooked genius who had saved the day. And in that moment, he had found his place in the spotlight. The event had ended, but Maxwell's mind still buzzed with the magnitude of the day. It felt like a dream, a whirlwind of moments he never expected, a day where he had gone from being the overlooked student to the hero who had saved it all. The applause, the standing ovation, the praise, it was all so foreign to him, so out of place in the life he had known. Maxwell wasn't someone who sought recognition. He had always been content to stay in the background, working quietly, solving problems no one else could see. But now, as the final guests began to leave, the weight of the day settled on him like an unfamiliar burden. His mother, who had been sitting in the audience, was waiting for him outside the auditorium. She had seen everything: the crash, the panic, the chaos, and then the miraculous recovery. Maxwell had done it, she thought. He had saved the day. She had always known her son was special, but to see him in front of that audience, hailed as the hero, left her speechless. As Maxwell made his way through the crowd toward the exit, he was stopped by a man, tall, confident, with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. The man's gaze was focused, sharp, as he took a step forward and extended a hand. "I saw what you did today," the man said, his voice deep and commanding. "You've got a bright future, son. I don't see that kind of problem-solving every day. We need more minds like yours in the world." Maxwell blinked, unsure of what was happening. He had seen this man in the crowd earlier, but it hadn't registered who he was. Now, standing face to face with him, it became clear that this wasn't just a random encounter. The man continued, his tone shifting to something more personal. "How would you like to join a young tech startup initiative? We're offering full funding for your projects. We believe in what you did today. You've got real potential." Maxwell's heart skipped a beat. This was no small offer. The words tech startup and full funding echoed in his mind like a dream he never thought he would have. He glanced at the man's outstretched hand, unsure of how to respond. He had always worked quietly, behind the scenes, but never once had he imagined something like this being offered to him. The entrepreneur's gaze softened, noticing the hesitation in Maxwell's eyes. "Think about it, son. This could change everything for you, for your future." Maxwell felt a rush of emotions: excitement, disbelief, and fear. He didn't know what to say, or even if he could trust what was happening. It felt too big, too sudden. But when he turned to look at his mother, standing a few feet away, he saw the look in her eyes. Her face had gone from surprise to something else, something he couldn't quite place, but it was clear she understood the gravity of the moment. She had always worked so hard, doing everything she could to give him a chance at a better life, but she had never imagined something like this. This was an opportunity that could change everything for their family. This wasn't just about Maxwell. It was about them, about their future. Maxwell turned back to the entrepreneur, who was still waiting for a response, his hand extended, his expression patient but firm. Maxwell's mind raced, the weight of his family's struggles pressing down on him. This opportunity, this rare, once-in-a-lifetime chance, could change everything. It was the kind of break he never dreamed of, the kind of chance that could lift them from the struggle they had lived in for so long. He took a deep breath, the words coming out more confident than he felt. "I'd like to know more," he said, his voice steady. The entrepreneur's smile widened. "That's what I like to hear. We'll talk soon." As the man walked away, Maxwell stood there for a moment, still processing everything. His mother was now by his side, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. She opened her mouth to speak, but couldn't seem to find the words. Maxwell reached out, taking her hand. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with quiet certainty, "this could change everything. This is our chance." She blinked, and for a moment, it seemed as if she might burst into tears. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maxwell, this is too much. I never thought anything like this would happen. You've always worked so hard. But this—" Maxwell smiled, squeezing her hand tightly. "I know, Mom. I know. But now we don't have to struggle anymore. This is our chance to do something bigger than we ever thought possible." The two of them stood there for a few more moments, the weight of the opportunity settling in. It was surreal, too much to process in one moment. But for the first time in a long time, Maxwell could see a future for himself, a future not defined by hard work alone, but by the kind of chance that most people never got. Over the following weeks, the startup initiative followed through with their offer, and Maxwell was brought on as a young innovator. They provided him with the resources he needed to develop his own projects, giving him the freedom to work without the financial constraints that had once held him back. With their support, Maxwell began to build the next big tech innovation, something he had only ever dreamed of before. He was no longer just the quiet, overlooked student. He was now the creator, the innovator, the one with the tools to shape the future. In the coming months, Maxwell's life transformed. The days spent cleaning floors in the factory, struggling to make ends meet, were now behind him. His work in the tech industry became a symbol of what was possible when opportunity met talent, and as his projects began to gain traction, he knew that he was only just beginning. The road ahead was filled with limitless possibilities. Maxwell's journey from overlooked student to hero of the event had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. It had started with a quiet question, a simple moment of curiosity, and had grown into something far beyond what he had dreamed. What had seemed like an impossible moment, one marked by failure and chaos, was now a story of redemption, talent, and incredible opportunity. And Maxwell, once a kid with no hope beyond the factory floor, now stood on the precipice of something bigger. His future, once defined by struggle, was now one of limitless possibility. What a journey, right? I hope you enjoyed today's story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, drop a comment below letting us know what you think and where you're watching from. Thanks for being part of the story family. See you next time.